Paris burst out in flames on Labor Day as people hit the streets to protest against the government. More than 1 lakh people took part in the violent protests wherein petrol bombs were hurled and there was constant clashes between the police and the demonstrators. There was chaos, complete one at that, anarchy as some called it, on the streets of Paris as the protesters continued to express their anger against Macron's pension reforms that raised the retirement age from 62 to 64. Tear gas eventually choked up the streets. It put a pause to the wild demonstrations. For the French, it is no longer a matter of retirement, but an issue of work-life balance for the citizens, and they are hell-bent on demanding their rights. Today, airlines in France are on a strike to continue the May Day disruptions, resulting in several delays and cancellations of flights. But what exactly transpired on the day of May 1st, Labor Day, as it is marked across the world? Violent clashes broke out in multiple cities. There are several people that have been injured. Several hundreds have been detained by the police as well. Take a look at how it all unfolded.
Fires raged on city streets across France during May Day rallies Monday as black-clad anarchists clashed with police during union-led protests against French President Emmanuel Macron's controversial pension reform. In some areas, demonstrators pelted French police with Molotov cocktails and fireworks. Then, police were booed as they responded with tear gas. In Lyon, riot police were seen retreating on a bridge as projectiles were thrown. In another location, they were seen charging forward. Anarchists also clashed with riot police in the city of Nantes in front of regional offices and local administration buildings, some of which were burned. About 200 people were arrested, officials say, as hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets in protest. After Macron last month raised the retirement age by 2 years to 64, despite widespread and multi-sector strikes. The reform, which Macron says is necessary to protect the health of the pension budget, will be implemented gradually starting on September 1st. But protesters like Clara Bossard say Macron overstepped.
I think that democratically, these pension reforms don't represent us. We elected people who were supposed to listen to us, and we realized that we're not really being listened to because there were a lot of us on the streets. And these were reforms adopted by force. And I think this is unjust.
Trade unions had called for a big May Day turnout as they attempt to force a U-turn by Macron's government, which forced its pension law through without a final vote in the National Assembly. Opinion polls show a substantial majority of French people oppose the higher retirement age. And many workers say an out-of-touch Macron is indifferent to their daily hardships.
Sanjay Suri now joins us to get us the very latest for what's happening in France. Now, Sanjay, these reforms are going to come into effect in September, in fall. That's still 4 months away. So we are looking at 4 months of perhaps protests much like these.
Well, it could be more than 4 months. It does not look like these protests will die down, but at the same time, it does not look like they will be able to succeed in reversing the decision that Macron has taken. That decision was taken in a manner that was considered controversial and unacceptable. But in any case, it was passed through emergency legislation. But what is significant is, of course, that it was confirmed by a constitution court. So it is law. The law has now taken effect. The implementation will begin, as you say, from September and will continue in a phased manner until you have full implementation in the year 2030. Short of that, we are certain to see protests like this. Of course, on May Day, these were to be expected. It's Labor Day, and the unions certainly do plan protests on that day, whatever may be the prevailing situation. Here, the pension reform was clearly the trigger. We've had protests over this before. This still was not as big as some of the protests that came earlier, and certainly it must be the hope of the French government that in time this anger will die down and that people will begin to accept the new changes as final law, as they have done previously.
Now, Sanjay, Emmanuel Macron has said that his doors are always open for negotiations, but the protesters, the trade unions, have been adamant that nothing short of a reversal is acceptable to them. That is something that Emmanuel Macron, his government, is not ready to even talk of. So how exactly are they going to find the middle ground?
Well, it's going to be a matter of negotiation, and always with a confrontation, people take different and apparently irreconcilable positions, but negotiations, talks sometimes bring solutions that are not immediately evident. Here we've seen the efforts that have been made by the Macron government. They're promising a lot of other benefits to employees to try and offset this issue of the reforms. They will offer talks, they will try to reason it out and try to convince people, which is something they've not done a very good job with so far. A good deal of the problem has been communication. It has been the view of the Macron government that these reforms are necessary, financially necessary, that the debt burden being caused by the present pension system is unsustainable, and that it would hit a high of as much as $13 billion a year by 2027.
Yes.
And that the reforms are necessary to reduce that deficit. Now, that has been the argument, but it's not been an argument that's been put forward very effectively, certainly, as we can see, not very convincingly.
And that argument hasn't cut any ice with those protesters. They didn't even before it was made into a law or even after. Fiscal prudence is what the government and Emmanuel Macron have been pushing forth. Unfortunately, that hasn't resonated. But these May Day protests haven't just been restricted to France or to cities across in that country. There are several other places that have witnessed similar such protests. We've seen people take to the streets, voice their solidarity, their support to the people in France as well. These included Turkey, South Korea and Philippines. Take a look at these protests from around the world that took place on the occasion of Labor Day.
Look at Macron!